They said she was cursed. It wasn't a shout, but a whisper that slithered through the dust-choked streets of redemption, a poison that seeped into the floorboards of the saloon, the pews of the church, the very heart of the town. For years, Alani wore that curse like a shroud. At 27, the bloom of youth was still on her cheeks, but the town looked at her like she was already a ghost, her chances at a life buried under the weight of their judgment. She was Apache, and in their eyes, that was the beginning and the end of her story. She walked with her head held high, a queen in a kingdom of her own sorrow. She remembered the first boy, the rancher's son with hair the color of sun-scorched wheat. He'd promised her forever under the shade of the cottonwoods, his voice a hopeful tremble. But the town's whispers grew louder than his promises. The laughter, the pointed fingers, the cold shoulders. They chipped away at his courage until there was nothing left. He vanished from her life, his eyes never meeting hers again, leaving a wound that festered in the silence of her heart. A wound she learned to hide from the world. So she worked. She filled her days with the rhythm of survival, gathering herbs from the hills, their scents clinging to her hands, stitching torn shirts for the very men who mocked her, carrying water for the women who turned their backs on her in the street. The children, innocent of their parents' venom, adored her. They'd cling to her skirts, their small hands a fleeting comfort against the vastness of her solitude. She was useful, but never wanted. A tool to be used, then put away. A ghost they could tolerate, but never embrace. In the dead of night, when the loneliness was a physical weight, she would press her palms to her eyes, swallowing the sobs that threatened to tear her apart. But not everyone was blind. Old Ruth, the innkeeper with eyes as wrinkled as a desert map, saw the strength beneath the sorrow. On the cruelest mornings, Alani would find a warm loaf of bread on her doorstep, a silent offering of kindness. And there was Samuel, a boy of 14 orphaned by fever, who saw her not as a curse but as a legend. "You're the brave one," he'd say, his voice full of awe. "You walk like the wind, untouchable." His simple faith was a balm, but it couldn't fill the echoing emptiness inside her. The cruelty, however, never slept. One evening, the saloon erupted. Jedediah, a rancher with a belly full of whiskey and a heart full of hate, stood on a table and roared to the crowd. He boasted that no man would ever be fool enough to saddle himself with the Apache woman, that she was destined to walk alone until her bones turned to dust in the desert. The room shook with stomping boots and jeering laughter. Alani was there, in the corner, and she heard every word. She didn't flinch, she didn't cry. She simply rose, her posture unbroken, and walked out, leaving them to drown in their own ugliness. The cold night air was a shock, and only then did the tears fall, silent trails on her stoic face. But she wasn't alone. In the shadows by the hitching post, a man leaned against his horse. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't even smiled. A cowboy, his coat battered by 100 storms, his hat pulled low. He watched her pass, and in his eyes there was no pity. There was recognition, as if the jagged scars on her soul matched the ones hidden deep within his own. He watched her walk away, a solitary figure against the endless dark, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he had just seen the other half of his own broken heart. The next morning, the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and red. Alani was already moving, her muscles aching from the weight of the herbs she'd gathered at dawn. As she hefted the heavy basket, a shadow fell over her. It was him, the cowboy from the night before. He didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, his hands rough and calloused, and reached for the basket. Pride, her oldest and most stubborn companion, flared within her. She resisted, pulling back. But his eyes held no challenge, no demand. He just waited, his silence a strange and powerful comfort. It wasn't the offer of a hero saving a damsel. It was the simple, unspoken understanding of a shared burden. She let him take it. They walked back to her small cabin, the space between them filled with a quiet that was more meaningful than any conversation. He said little, asked nothing, and that, she realized, was a kindness she had never known. Men always wanted something, always had questions, always tried to peel back her layers to see the wounds beneath. This man, Silas, as she would learn he was called, seemed content to just exist in her orbit. A silent, steady presence. A planet circling a lonely star. In the days that followed, he was just there. She'd wake to find the broken rail outside the inn mended. The water trough for the town horses would be full before anyone else was awake. He never crowded her, never demanded her time or her thanks. He simply saw what was broken and fixed it, saw what was needed and provided it. He moved with a purpose that seemed disconnected from the rhythms of the town, a man following a map only he could read. She didn't know his story, didn't know what wars he had fought to put that haunted look in his eyes, but his quiet strength began to soften the razor-sharp edges of her world. Samuel, the orphan boy, quickly latched onto the stranger. He'd follow Silas around, chattering endlessly, his hero worship plain for all to see. And Silas, in his quiet way, was good to the boy. He taught him how to lift heavy loads without straining his back, how to read the clouds for rain, how to treat a woman with a quiet respect that was more powerful than any flowery compliment. Alani watched them, a man and a boy forming a strange, unspoken family, and a dangerous warmth began to bloom in her chest. Hope, a feeling she had long since buried. But hope, in a place like Redemption, was a dangerous thing. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. At first it was just curious glances. Then came the smirks. The whispers started again, this time sharper, crueler. They said Silas was a fool, wasting his time on a cursed woman. They said he'd get tired of his charity project and ride out one morning, leaving her more broken than before. The laughter that followed her through the streets was louder now, amplified by his presence. A spectacle for them to enjoy. And yet, he stayed. Every insult, every sneer seemed to anchor him more firmly to her side. It was as if their hate was the soil in which his strange devotion grew. One evening, the scorn finally boiled over. Alani was crossing the dusty main street, Samuel skipping ahead of her, when Jedediah, the drunken rancher, stumbled out of the saloon. He blocked her path, his face a mask of drunken contempt. He shoved her, hard. Still here? He sneered, his voice thick and ugly. A curse on this town, unwanted, untouchable. She staggered, the breath knocked from her lungs. The world tilted, the faces of the watching crowd blurring into a single monstrous sneer. All the years of pain, of rejection, of silent suffering crashed down on her at once. For a heartbeat, she thought she would finally break. Then she heard it, the sound of boots on hard-packed earth. Slow, deliberate. Silas stepped out of the dusk, his tall frame eclipsing the setting sun. He placed himself between her and Jedediah, a living shield. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his low tone silenced the entire street. "She is not unwanted," he said, his eyes locked on Jedediah's. The crowd held its breath, the air crackled with tension, and then Silas spoke the words that would change everything. "She is mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Jedediah, for the first time in his life, seemed to shrink. The townspeople just stared, their mouths agape. It was one thing to see the cowboy helping her, another thing entirely to hear him claim her. Claim her. The word hung in the air, a declaration of war against the town's oldest and most sacred prejudice. Alani stood behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt his strength, his certainty, and it was like taking her first breath after a lifetime of drowning. He hadn't just stood beside her. He had stood for her. That night, something inside her finally broke open. Under a vast, star-dusted sky, she told him everything. The words tumbled out, a torrent of pain held back for a decade. The rancher's son, the whispers, the loneliness, the gnawing fear that the town was right, that she was fundamentally unlovable, a blight on the world. Her voice cracked as she spoke the words of the curse aloud, the words that had defined her existence. They said I'll never have a man. He listened, his gaze never leaving her face. When she was done, her voice a raw whisper, he took her hands. His touch was firm, grounding. He pressed her palms against his chest so she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. Alani, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. His eyes, clear and unwavering in the faint starlight, held no pity, no doubt. Only a fierce, burning certainty. A certainty that seemed to reach inside her and extinguish the cold fire of her fear. He leaned in close, his breath warm against her cheek, and repeated the promise he had made in the darkness just a few nights before, a vow that sealed her fate and shattered the curse forever. You already have me. The fire crackled. The boy, Samuel, watching from a distance, saw her face in the flickering light, and for the first time he saw her smile, a real smile. Not the pained, polite one she gave the townsfolk, but a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. A smile that promised a new dawn. From the window of the inn, old Ruth clutched her apron, tears tracing paths through the wrinkles on her face. She had witnessed a miracle, the breaking of a chain, the healing of a wound that had bled for a generation. But breaking a curse isn't a single event. It's a war, fought one battle at a time. The dawn came, and with it, the cold reality of the town. His words had been a shield, but the town's hatred was a relentless storm. Jedediah was not a man to be publicly shamed. His power in redemption was built on fear, and Silas had challenged that fear. The whispers turned to open threats. Men who had once smirked at Alani now glared at Silas with open hostility. Jedediah's ranch hands would follow him, their presence a constant, silent menace. The air in town grew thick, heavy, with the promise of violence. Silas seemed not to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He continued his quiet routine, mending what was broken, helping where he was needed. But now, Alani worked beside him. She no longer walked with her head down, avoiding eye contact. She walked at his side, a silent partner in his quiet defiance. They were a team, an island of two in a sea of contempt. But Alani saw the toll it was taking. She saw the way his hand hovered near the worn pistol at his hip when Jedediah's men were near. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He was a rock, but even rocks could be worn down by a constant tide. One afternoon, as Silas was helping Samuel repair a fence at the edge of town, 3 of Jedediah's largest ranch hands cornered them. Alani was nearby, gathering wild sage, and her blood ran cold. "The boss wants a word with you, stranger," the leader grunted, his hand resting on the hilt of a large knife. He don't like outsiders sticking their nose where it don't belong, especially not for her. He spat the word out like it was poison. Silas didn't even turn around. "Tell your boss if he wants to talk. He knows where to find me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now get out of here before you scare the boy." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He took a step forward. "I don't think you understand. This is a warning." In a blur of motion, Silas stood. He moved with a speed and precision that was utterly terrifying. It wasn't the clumsy brawling of a saloon fight. It was something else, something trained, something lethal. Before the man could even draw his knife, Silas had him by the throat, his other hand twisting the man's arm at an impossible angle. The other 2 men froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of such effortless violence. "I understand perfectly," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "And this is my warning. Leave her alone. Leave the boy alone. Leave me alone. Or the next time we have this conversation, you won't be able to walk away from it." He shoved the man back, sending him stumbling into his friends. They stared at Silas, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Then they turned and practically ran, disappearing into the dust. Samuel looked at Silas with wide, worshipful eyes. But Alani felt a new kind of fear, not for her safety, but for his. Who was this man? This quiet, gentle soul who could turn into a deadly weapon in the blink of an eye. That night she asked him, "Who are you, Silas? Really?" He looked at the fire for a long time, the flames dancing in his haunted eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of the past. "My name isn't Silas," he said, and the ground seemed to fall away beneath her. "It's Jacob, and I'm not a cowboy. I'm a U.S. Marshal." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than any fistfight. A U.S. Marshal, here, in redemption. It didn't make any sense. He saw the confusion on her face and continued, the story pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. 20 years ago, his father, also a marshal, had been tracking a gang of ruthless gold thieves. The trail led him to this valley. And then it went cold. His father, a legendary lawman, had simply vanished. The gang, the gold, all of it. Gone. For 2 decades, Jacob had been haunted by his father's disappearance. It was the great unsolved mystery of his life, a wound that had never healed. He'd left the marshals officially, but he had never stopped searching. A few months ago, he'd gotten a break. A dying outlaw in a prison down south had confessed to being part of that long-lost gang. He'd told Jacob a story of betrayal. The leader of the gang, a man named Cyrus, had murdered his own partners, murdered Jacob's father, and disappeared with the entire gold shipment. The outlaw didn't know where Cyrus had gone, but he gave Jacob one clue: a name. The name of the man Cyrus had betrayed and killed right before he vanished. A quiet, unassuming rancher who had stumbled upon their camp at the wrong time. A man named Jedediah. Alani stared at him, her mind reeling. Jedediah. The man who had tormented her. The man who had led the town against her. It couldn't be a coincidence. But the story didn't add up. Jedediah was the richest man in the valley, not a murder victim. Jacob explained the chilling twist. The outlaw had been old and delirious. He must have gotten the names mixed up. Jacob was convinced that the man who now called himself Jedediah was, in fact, the murderer, Cyrus. He had killed the real Jedediah, stolen his identity, and used the stolen gold to build his ranching empire. He had hidden in plain sight for 20 years. "I came here for him," Jacob said, his voice laced with cold fury. "I came here to find the man who murdered my father." But then, he said, he saw her. He saw the town's cruelty, saw her strength, and his mission, his lifelong obsession with revenge, had become complicated. He had come to redemption for justice, but he had found something else. He had found her. The 2 stories, his and hers, had become tangled together. A 20-year-old murder and a lifetime of whispered curses. He was certain they were connected. Cyrus, now Jedediah, had built his kingdom on a foundation of lies and blood. A man, that ruthless, would do anything to protect his secrets. "Your curse, Alani," Jacob said, his eyes locking with hers. "I don't think it was just about prejudice. A man like that, he needed the town to fear and isolate you. He needed to make sure no one would ever listen to you. The question is, why?" The question hung in the air, a terrifying puzzle. Why her? What did she know? What had her parents known? Her memory was a blur of shadows and half-remembered lullabies. Her parents had died when she was just a child, her father in a supposed hunting accident, her mother from a swift and sudden fever just months later. The town had called it part of the curse. Now she saw it for what it likely was: murder. Her mind raced, grasping for fragments of the past. She remembered her father, a skilled Apache scout. He knew this land better than anyone, knew its secrets, its hidden canyons, its forgotten trails. What might he have seen 20 years ago? She remembered a small carved bird he had made for her, a hawk. He'd told her it was a symbol of a keen eye, of one who sees what others miss. And he'd told her a story about a thunder cave hidden deep in the hills, a place where the mountain kept its secrets. It was a child's story, she'd thought, a fairy tale. But now it felt like a clue, a message from the grave. She told Jacob about the thunder cave, her voice trembling, a place her father had discovered, a place he said was sacred. Jacob's eyes lit up with a grim intensity. A hidden cave would be the perfect place to hide a body, or a fortune in stolen gold. The town's cruelty suddenly made a new, horrific kind of sense. Jedediah hadn't just encouraged the whispers, he had orchestrated them. He had poisoned the town against her family, turning them into outcasts, ensuring that if her father ever tried to speak up about what he'd seen, no one would believe him. He'd made them ghosts long before he'd actually killed them. And he'd kept the curse alive around her, a wall to keep her isolated and powerless, terrified that she might somehow carry a piece of her father's knowledge, a fragment of the truth that could destroy him. Her entire life, her entire identity as the cursed woman, had been a lie constructed to protect a killer. The weight of this revelation was crushing. But beneath the grief, a new feeling sparked to life: rage. A cold, hard anger that burned away the years of shame and fear. They had not just mocked her, they had stolen her family, her past, her very name. As she looked at Jacob, she saw the same fire reflected in his eyes. This was no longer just his quest for revenge or her fight for acceptance. It was their war. "Let's go to the cave," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Let's find out what my father died to protect." Their journey into the hills was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Alani led the way, following a trail that was more memory than path. The land itself seemed to guide her, whispering directions her father had taught her long ago. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin and cold. The world below, the town of redemption, shrank until it was just an ugly scar on the landscape. Up here, surrounded by the ancient, silent rocks, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She was her father's daughter, and this was his land. She found the entrance exactly where she remembered it, hidden behind a curtain of tangled vines. It was a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Inside, the air was still and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. Jacob lit a lantern, and the small flame pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing a cavern larger than they had expected. The walls glistened with moisture, and the only sound was the slow, steady drip of water. "The Thunder Cave," Alani whispered. Her father had told her that during storms, the wind rushing through the narrow entrance made a sound like rolling thunder. They moved deeper into the cave, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. And then they saw it. Tucked into a recess in the far wall, almost completely hidden by a rockfall, were several rotting leather satchels. Jacob's breath hitched. He reached out a trembling hand and pulled one free. The leather was stiff and mildewed, but the bag was heavy. He fumbled with the clasp, his knuckles white. He turned the bag over, and a river of gold coins spilled onto the cavern floor, shining like a dragon's hoard in the flickering lamplight. It was the stolen payroll. It had been here the whole time. But there was more. In another bag, tucked beneath the gold, was a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. Jacob carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a journal, its pages warped and stained by time and damp. And lying on top of the journal was a U.S. Marshal's badge. A single dark hole marred its silver surface, right through the center. A bullet hole. Jacob stared at the badge, his face a mask of grief and fury. "My father's," he whispered, his voice cracking. He opened the journal. The handwriting was his father's. It was his last report. The journal told the whole story. Marshal Daniel Colt had tracked the Cyrus gang to the valley. He'd discovered their hideout, this very cave, but he was ambushed. The journal described the betrayal in stark, heartbreaking detail. Cyrus had shot his own men in the back, then turned the gun on the marshal, but Daniel Colt had been tougher than Cyrus expected. Wounded, he'd managed to fight back, shooting Cyrus in the leg before he was finally overwhelmed. In his final dying moments, he had scrawled this last entry, hiding the journal and his badge with the gold, a final message to whoever might find him. He described Cyrus perfectly, right down to a distinctive scar above his left eye, a scar that Jedediah kept hidden under the brim of his hat. But the most damning entry was the last one. Just before the ambush, Marshal Colt had met a local scout, an Apache man who knew the hills, a man who had seen the gang and had come to warn him, a man named Taza, Alani's father. He hadn't just stumbled upon a crime, he had tried to stop it. He had died a hero, not a victim. The hunting accident was a lie. Jedediah, Cyrus, had hunted him down and silenced him. He had murdered her father in cold blood, and he had murdered her mother too, likely with a slow-acting poison to make it look like illness. He had eradicated her entire family to protect his bloody secret. They sat in the silence of the cave, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. The gold, the badge, the journal. It was everything. The proof they needed to destroy Jedediah and reclaim the names of their fathers. They packed the evidence, their movements slow and deliberate. As they stepped out of the cave and back into the sunlight, Alani felt a profound shift within her. The shame she had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a righteous fury. She was not the daughter of a curse. She was the daughter of a hero, and it was time for the whole world to know it. Their return to redemption was not quiet. They didn't sneak back under the cover of darkness. They rode down the main street in the bright light of midday, side by side. Jacob was no longer Silas, the quiet cowboy. He was Marshal Jacob Colt, and his face was set like stone. Alani rode beside him, her back straight, her chin high. The townspeople stopped and stared, sensing the shift in the air. Something was about to break. They didn't stop at the inn or Alani's cabin. They rode straight to the saloon, the black heart of Jedediah's kingdom. Jacob dismounted and threw the saloon doors open with a crash that silenced every conversation. Alani was right behind him. The room was full of Jedediah's men, but they all fell back as Jacob strode to the bar. Jedediah himself was there, holding a glass of whiskey, a smug look on his face. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look what the cat dragged in. I thought I told you to get out of my town." Jacob didn't answer. He reached into his saddlebag and threw the gold-filled satchel onto the bar. It landed with a heavy metallic thud. Then he placed the journal beside it. And finally, with deliberate slowness, he set his father's tarnished, bullet-pierced badge on top of the journal. A collective gasp went through the room. Jedediah's face went pale. The smugness vanished, replaced by the hunted look of a cornered animal. "What is this?" he blustered, but his voice lacked its usual force. "That's my father's badge," Jacob said, his voice ringing with authority. "Marshal Daniel Colt, the man you murdered 20 years ago, Cyrus." He said the name, Cyrus, and it was like a physical blow. The color drained completely from Jedediah's face. His men shifted uncomfortably, looking from Jacob to their boss, their loyalty wavering in the face of this impossible accusation. Jacob opened the journal. In a clear, strong voice, he read his father's final words. He read about the betrayal, the ambush, the murder of the gang members. He read the description of the killer, his voice rising as he described the scar above the left eye. With a flick of his wrist, Jacob knocked Jedediah's hat from his head. And there it was, for all to see. A thin, white scar just above his left eye. The saloon was utterly silent. Jacob then told them the rest of the story. He told them how Cyrus had stolen Jedediah's name, his life, and built an empire on blood money. And then he turned to Alani. "This man didn't just murder my father," Jacob declared, his voice thundering through the room. "He murdered another hero that day, a man named Taza, an Apache scout who tried to stop him, Alani's father." He looked directly at the crowd, at the faces of the men and women who had whispered and sneered for years. "The curse you've all been whispering about? It was a lie this killer created to isolate a family he had destroyed, a lie to make you fear the one person who carried the truth in her blood. He turned you all into his accomplices, using your own prejudice to guard his secrets. She is not cursed. She is the daughter of the man who died trying to save this town from the monster who has ruled it for 20 years. The truth, raw and undeniable, settled over the room. The years of casual cruelty, of smug superiority, of mindless prejudice, it all coalesced into a suffocating wave of collective shame. They looked at Alani, truly looked at her for the first time, and they didn't see a curse. They saw the legacy of their own cowardice. Jedediah, his face a twisted mask of rage and panic, knew he was finished. The lies had crumbled. The fear he commanded was gone. In a final, desperate act of self-destruction, he drew his pistol. But he was no longer the ruthless killer Cyrus. He was a soft, aging rancher whose reflexes were dulled by years of easy living. Before he could even aim, a bottle flew through the air, shattering against his gun hand. It was Samuel. The boy stood by the doorway, his face pale but determined, having followed them to the saloon. The distraction was all Jacob needed. He moved like lightning, not drawing his own gun, but closing the distance. A single, brutal strike disarmed Jedediah. A second sent the larger man crashing to the floor, defeated and pathetic. Justice hadn't come from the barrel of a gun, it had come from the undeniable weight of the truth. The spell was broken, not just for Alani, but for the entire town. Jedediah, Cyrus, was locked in his own storeroom to await the federal marshals Jacob had already sent for. The stolen gold was secured as evidence, but the real change happened in the hearts of the people. They approached Alani one by one, their faces etched with a shame that was deeper than any apology. Old Ruth hugged her, sobbing. The rancher's son, now a grown man, met her eyes for the first time in a decade, and the guilt he carried was plain to see. She didn't offer forgiveness. It wasn't hers to give, but she offered them a chance to be better. She offered them the truth. As dusk fell, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, Alani stood with Jacob on the porch of her small cabin. It was their porch now. The whispers were gone, replaced by a quiet respect. The curse was dead, buried with the lies that had given it life. She was no longer Alani the outcast, Alani the cursed. She was Alani, daughter of Taza, a hero, and he was Jacob, son of Daniel, a lawman who had finally brought his father's killer to justice. They had come to this town for different reasons, one to survive and one for revenge, but they had found the same thing: a home, a future. "They said I would never have a man," she whispered, the words no longer holding any power over her. Jacob took her hand, his grip firm and steady. He looked out at the endless horizon, at the first stars beginning to burn in the darkening sky. "No," he said, his voice full of a promise that was as vast and certain as the night itself. "You have me forever." What do you think really motivated the town to be so cruel for so long? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.